Tonight, we will be exploring the brutal reality of life in humanity's first permanent settlement on Mars. Forget everything you've seen in movies about heroic pioneers and scientific breakthroughs. I'm going to tell you exactly why. If you were dropped into the first Mars colony, you wouldn't last 24 hours. This isn't science fiction. This is the documented truth about what happened to the first 1,000 humans who tried to make Mars their home. The year was 2157, and Sarah Chen stepped off the transport ship Meridian onto the rusty surface of Mars with the confidence of someone who had trained for this moment her entire adult life. She was 32, a hydroponics engineer with dual doctorates in atmospheric chemistry and closed system agriculture. She had spent 5 years in Earth's most advanced Mars simulation facilities. She had memorized every protocol, survived every training scenario, and scored in the top 1% of all colonial candidates. She would be dead within 18 hours. But let me back up and explain why even the most prepared human being couldn't survive what awaited them in New Eden, Mars Colony 1. The first thing you need to understand is that Mars wants to kill you, not in some poetic sense, but in very specific, immediate ways that your Earth-adapted body simply cannot handle. When Sarah stepped off that transport, she was wearing the most advanced environmental suit humanity had ever created. A marvel of engineering that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. That suit was the only thing standing between her and instant death. Mars's atmosphere is 96% carbon dioxide with virtually no oxygen. The atmospheric pressure is less than 1% of Earth's. So low that your blood would literally boil in your veins if you were exposed without protection. The average temperature is minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit, with daily fluctuations that can swing 100 degrees or more. And the radiation? Without Earth's magnetic field and thick atmosphere to protect you, you'd receive a lethal dose of cosmic radiation in just a few months of exposure. But Sarah knew all this. Every colonist did. What they didn't know was how these hostile conditions would interact with the psychological and social pressures of being trapped in a sealed environment with 999 other people, all of them slowly going insane. Sarah's first indication that something was wrong came during the orientation briefing. She had expected to be greeted by Colony Administrator Martinez, whose cheerful video messages had been transmitted to Earth for the past 3 years. Instead, she found herself in a cramped meeting room listening to a haggard man who introduced himself as Acting Administrator Patel. "Where's Martinez?" asked Dr. James Wu, one of Sarah's fellow newcomers. Patel's eye twitched slightly. Administrator Martinez suffered a psychological break 6 months ago. He's currently in medical isolation. Patel's voice was carefully neutral, but Sarah noticed how the veteran colonists avoided eye contact when Martinez was mentioned. The briefing continued with a recitation of colony rules that seemed excessive even for a closed environment. No one was allowed outside the main habitat modules without explicit permission and a 2-person escort. All food distribution was strictly controlled and monitored. Personal communications with Earth were limited to 10 minutes per month and subject to review. Most disturbing of all, there was a strict curfew. All colonists had to be in their assigned quarters from 2,200 to 600 hours. "Why do we need a curfew?" Sarah asked. Patel's expression darkened. "Because people do things at night when they think no one is watching. Dangerous things. Colony-threatening things. Sarah would learn what he meant soon enough. After the briefing, Sarah was assigned to Hydroponic Space 7, a vast chamber filled with growing towers that stretched from floor to ceiling. The bay was supposed to be a marvel of efficiency, producing fresh vegetables and recycling water and atmosphere in a perfectly balanced ecosystem. What Sarah found was a nightmare of failing systems and dying plants. Her supervisor, Dr. Lisa Park, had been on Mars for 2 years. Ew, she looked like she had aged a decade in that time. Her skin was pale and drawn. Her hair was falling out in patches, and her hands shook constantly. Symptoms Sarah recognized as radiation poisoning, malnutrition, and severe stress. "Don't look so shocked," Dr. Park said, noticing Sarah's expression. "We all look like this after a few months. The medical bay has been out of proper radiation medication for 8 months. The food supplements are running low. And the stress," she laughed bitterly. "Well, you'll see." Sarah spent her first day trying to assess the condition of the hydroponic systems. What she found was catastrophic. The automated nutrient delivery systems were failing regularly, causing entire crops to die. The water recycling units were operating at 60% efficiency, meaning the colony was slowly poisoning itself with its own waste. The atmospheric processors that were supposed to scrub carbon dioxide from the air and maintain proper oxygen levels were breaking down faster than the maintenance crews could repair them. "How are you people still alive?" Sarah asked Dr. Park. "Barely," Park replied. "We're consuming our emergency reserves faster than we're producing new resources. At current rates, we have maybe 4 months of food left, 2 months of clean water. And the atmospheric processors will fail completely within 6 weeks." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with Mars's cold. Why hasn't Earth been informed? Why aren't supply ships being sent? Dr. Park's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Oh, they've been informed. We've been screaming for help for over a year. But you know what Earth's response has been. Make do with available resources. Additional supplies will be sent when budget allows. They're treating us like we're some kind of survivalist experiment." That night, Sarah lay in her cramped quarters, a space barely large enough for a narrow bed, a small desk, and a storage locker, trying to process what she had learned. The colony wasn't just struggling, it was failing catastrophically. And yet, Earth continued to send new colonists every 6 months, apparently unaware of or unconcerned about the desperate situation. She was jolted awake at 230 hours by screaming. Sarah grabbed her emergency light and stepped into the corridor, despite the curfew regulations. Other colonists were emerging from their quarters, all looking toward the main junction where the screaming was coming from. As they got closer, Sarah could see a crowd gathered around something on the floor. In the center of the crowd was Martinez, the former colony administrator. Sarah recognized him from the promotional videos. But the man on the floor bore little resemblance to the confident leader she had seen on Earth. Martinez was emaciated. His hair had fallen out in clumps, and his skin was covered in sores that suggested severe malnutrition and radiation exposure. He was naked, curled in a fetal position, screaming about spiders crawling under his skin. "Someone get Dr. Ramirez," Acting Administrator Patel shouted as he pushed through the crowd. "Dr. Ramirez had another breakdown yesterday." Someone replied, "She's sedated and medical." Sarah watched in horror as Patel and 2 other colonists tried to restrain Martinez, who was now clawing at his own skin. leaving bloody gouges. This was the man who had been sending those cheerful status reports to Earth just 6 months ago. What happened to him? Sarah whispered to the colonist next to her. Same thing that happens to all of us, eventually. The woman replied. Her name tag identified her as Dr. Jennifer Reeves, a geologist who had been on Mars for 18 months. The isolation, the constant stress, the knowledge that we're all going to die here. It breaks something in your brain. Martinez lasted longer than most. Some people crack in the first month. As medical personnel finally arrived to sedate Martinez, Sarah began to understand the true horror of the Mars colony. It wasn't just the hostile environment or the failing infrastructure. It was the psychological pressure of being trapped in a tin can with 1,000 other people, all of whom knew they were probably going to die, all of whom were slowly losing their sanity. But Sarah's real education in the realities of Mars colonial life began the next morning when she reported to Hydroponics Bay 7. For her second day of work, Dr. Park was waiting for her with an expression of barely controlled panic. We have a problem, she said. Bay 4's atmospheric recycler failed completely overnight. The entire crop is dead, and the bay is filled with toxic gas. Sarah followed Dr. Park to Bay 4, where emergency crews in full environmental suits were attempting to clear the air. Through the observation window, Sarah could see thousands of dead plants, their leaves brown and withered. This represented weeks of food production for hundreds of people. How often does this happen? Sarah asked. We lose at least one bay a month to system failures, Dr. Park replied. Sometimes more. The replacement parts we need simply aren't available. We're cannibalizing working systems to keep the critical ones operational, but we're fighting a losing battle. Sarah spent the morning helping to assess the damage and plan emergency repairs. It was during this work that she made a discovery that would haunt her for the rest of her short time on Mars. Hidden behind a maintenance panel in Bay 4, Sarah found a collection of personal items, photos, letters, a child's toy. She was about to ask Dr. Park about them when she noticed the dates on the letters. They were addressed to Dr. Michael Torres, dated just 3 months ago. Dr. Park, Sarah said carefully. What happened to Dr. Torres? Dr. Park's face went white. Who told you about Torres? No one. I found these items. Where is he? Dr. Park looked around nervously, then pulled Sarah into a storage closet. Torres had a breakdown. Started claiming that the colony administrators were deliberately sabotaging the systems to reduce the population. He said they were murdering people through managed system failures. Sarah felt a chill. What happened to him? He disappeared one night. Said he went outside without authorization and his environmental suit failed. But Dr. Park's voice dropped to a whisper. Torres was an expert on environmental systems. He would never have made that kind of mistake. The implication was clear and terrifying. Sarah was beginning to realize that the colonists weren't just dying from system failures and hostile environment. They were being eliminated by their own leadership. That afternoon, Sarah was assigned to help with water recycling maintenance, a job that took her into the colony's deepest levels. It was here that she made the discovery that would seal her fate. In a restricted section marked authorized personnel only, Sarah found records that revealed the true purpose of the Mars colony. Hidden among routine maintenance logs were communications between acting Administrator Patel and Earth Command. The messages made it clear that the colony was never intended to be self-sustaining. It was a long-term survival experiment designed to test the limits of human endurance in hostile environments. The colonists weren't pioneers. They were test subjects. The communications revealed that Earth Command was deliberately limiting supply shipments and replacement parts, forcing the colonists to make increasingly desperate choices about resource allocation. They were studying how human communities broke down under extreme stress, how social hierarchies changed when survival was at stake, and how far people could be pushed before they lost their sanity. The most chilling part was a message from Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the mission's chief psychologist on Earth. Maintain current stress levels. Mortality rate is within acceptable parameters. Continue monitoring social dynamics and leadership emergence patterns. Do not intervene unless total colony collapse is imminent. Sarah realized she was looking at evidence of one of the most monstrous experiments in human history. 1,000 people had been sent to Mars not to establish a colony, but to serve as laboratory rats in a study of human psychology under extreme conditions, and they had no idea. Sarah's hands were shaking as she copied the files to her personal storage device. She had to find a way to warn the other colonists, to expose what was being done to them. But as she prepared to leave the restricted area, she heard footsteps approaching. Acting Administrator Patel appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 security personnel. His expression was cold and calculating. "Ms. Chen," he said calmly, "I see you found your way into areas where you don't belong." Sarah tried to project confidence she didn't feel. "I was assigned to water recycling maintenance. I got lost." Patel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm sure you did. And I'm equally sure you haven't accessed any files or documentation that you weren't authorized to see." Sarah's heart was pounding, but she maintained eye contact. "Of course not." "Good," Patel said. "Because colonists who access restricted information tend to have accidents. Environmental suit failures, mostly. Very tragic, but these systems are so complex, and Mars is so unforgiving of even small mistakes. The threat was unmistakable." Sarah realized that Dr. Torres, and probably many others, had been murdered for discovering the truth about the colony's real purpose. "I understand," Sarah said quietly. "I'm sure you do," Patel replied. "Now, I think you should return to your quarters. You look tired." Mars can be very stressful for newcomers. Sarah left the restricted area under escort, her mind racing. She had evidence of the conspiracy, but no way to communicate it to Earth, or even to warn her fellow colonists without risking execution. She was trapped in a nightmare scenario where the people supposedly protecting the colony were actually conducting a monstrous experiment on its inhabitants. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters, trying to decide what to do. She could try to organize a rebellion among the colonists, but most of them were too broken by stress and malnutrition to be effective allies. She could attempt to sabotage critical systems to force an evacuation, but that would likely kill innocent people. Or she could try to stay quiet and survive, knowing that her silence was complicity in the deaths of her fellow colonists. She was still wrestling with these impossible choices when her door chimed. Sarah opened it to find Dr. Park standing in the corridor, looking nervous. "Can I come in?" Dr. Park whispered. "We need to talk." Once inside, Dr. Park activated a small electronic device that Sarah recognized as a signal jammer. There are listening devices in all the quarters, she explained. This will give us a few minutes of privacy. Leah, what's going on? Dr. Park took a deep breath. I know what you found in the restricted files. I found the same information 6 months ago. Sarah felt a surge of hope. Then you know what they're doing to us. We have to do something. Sarah, listen to me carefully. There have been others who discovered the truth. Dr. Torres wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. They all ended up dead, supposedly from accidents or system failures. So we do nothing? We just let them continue this experiment? Dr. Park's expression was grim. We survive. That's all we can do. And we try to help others survive too. Quietly. Without drawing attention, Sarah shook her head. That's not enough. People have a right to know what's being done to them, and they'll die for that knowledge. Just like Torres did. Sarah, you've been here 2 days. You don't understand how precarious our situation is. Patel and his security team control everything. Food distribution, water allocation, work assignments, medical care. Cross them, and you'll find yourself assigned to the most dangerous jobs with faulty equipment. As if to emphasize her point, the lights in Sarah's quarters flickered and went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Power grid failure, Dr. Park said grimly. Happens more and more often. The fusion reactor is operating beyond safe parameters, but we don't have the parts to properly maintain it. One day it's going to fail completely and we'll all freeze to death in the dark. Sarah realized that even if she wanted to rebel against the colony's leadership, the failing infrastructure made survival itself a full-time job. Every day brought new crises that demanded immediate attention just to keep people alive for another 24 hours. The next morning brought news that drove home the colony's desperate situation. During the night shift, a section of the main habitat module had suffered a catastrophic pressure loss. 6 colonists had been killed instantly when the atmospheric seal failed, and 12 more were in critical condition from decompression injuries. Sarah joined the emergency repair crews, working in environmental suits to patch the breach. As she worked, she could see the bodies of the victims, their faces twisted in agony. One of them was Dr. Jennifer Reeves, the geologist who had spoken to her about Martinez's breakdown just 2 nights before. Accident? Sarah asked Dr. Park during a break in the repair work. Dr. Park glanced around nervously before responding. Reeves was asking too many questions about missing colonists. She'd been collecting names and dates, trying to document what was really happening here. Sarah felt sick. The colony leadership wasn't just conducting an experiment. They were actively eliminating anyone who threatened to expose it, and they were skilled enough to make murders look like accidents. In an environment where accidents were common and often fatal. The repair work took 18 hours, during which time Sarah got her first real taste of how physically demanding life on Mars could be. The environmental suits were bulky and exhausting to work in. The tools were designed for Earth gravity and didn't function properly in Mars' reduced gravitational field. And the constant awareness that a single mistake could mean death created a level of stress that was almost unbearable. By the time the repairs were completed, Sarah was exhausted, dehydrated, and suffering from what she recognized as the early symptoms of radiation sickness: nausea, headache, and fatigue. The suit's radiation shielding was supposed to protect them during extended outside work, but like everything else in the colony, the protective equipment was failing. That evening, as Sarah lay in her quarters trying to recover, she received a message on her personal communicator. It was from Dr. Marcus Webb, another recent arrival who had been assigned to atmospheric processing. "Meet me in Storage Bay C in 10 minutes. Come alone. Something you need to see." Sarah hesitated. After what had happened to Dr. Reeves, any secret meeting could be a trap. But she also couldn't ignore the possibility that Dr. Webb had discovered additional evidence of the conspiracy. Storage Bay C was in one of the older sections of the colony, where the lighting was dim and the air recycling systems operated with an ominous wheeze. Sarah found Dr. Webb waiting near a stack of supply containers, his expression grim. "I found something," he said without preamble, "hidden in the atmospheric processing center. Records of deliberate system sabotage." Webb activated his tablet, showing Sarah maintenance logs that revealed a pattern of intentional neglect and sabotage. Critical repairs were being delayed or performed incorrectly. Safety systems were being disabled during routine maintenance and never reactivated. Most damning of all, there were orders from Acting Administrator Paddle to maintain system stress levels within experimental parameters. "They're not just studying us," Webb said. "They're actively creating the conditions that are killing us." Sarah felt a surge of anger that cut through her exhaustion and fear. "We have to expose this. We have to find a way to get this information to Earth." "I've been thinking about that," Webb replied. "The colony's main communication array is heavily monitored, but there's a backup transmitter in the emergency shelter. If we could access it." "That's in the restricted zone," Sarah said. "Security patrols that area constantly." "Not during shift change," Webb replied. "There's a 15-minute window twice a day when the patrols overlap. We could get in, transmit the data, and get out." Sarah realized that Webb was proposing a plan that would almost certainly get them killed. But as she thought about Dr. Reeves and Dr. Torres and all the other colonists who had died to protect the secret of the Mars experiment, she knew they had no choice. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow night, 2,000 hours, during the evening shift change." Sarah nodded, knowing she was probably agreeing to her own death sentence. But the alternative, remaining silent while more people were murdered, was unacceptable. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah went through the motions of her work in the hydroponics bay, all while planning for the evening's mission. She prepared a data package containing all the evidence she had collected, along with Dr. Webb's documentation of system sabotage. If they could transmit this information to Earth, it might save the lives of the remaining colonists. But as evening approached, Sarah began to suspect they were walking into a trap. The security patrols seemed more alert than usual, and she noticed that Acting Administrator Patel was taking an unusual interest in the schedules of recent arrivals. At 1950 hours, Sarah made her way to the rendezvous point near Storage Bay. See, Dr. Webb was already waiting, along with someone Sarah didn't expect, Dr. Park. "Lisa, what are you doing here?" Dr. Park's expression was filled with sadness and regret. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I tried to warn you, tried to keep you safe. But you wouldn't listen." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as she realized what was happening. "You told them." "I had to," Dr. Park said, tears streaming down her face. "They threatened to cut off medical supplies to the pediatric ward." "20 children would have died." "I couldn't." Security personnel emerged from the shadows, led by Acting Administrator Patel. Dr. Webb tried to run, but there was nowhere to go in the confined space of the storage bay. "Miss Chen," Dr. Webb, Patel said calmly. "I'm disappointed but not surprised. Mars has a way of revealing people's true nature very quickly. The truth is going to come out eventually," Sarah said, trying to project defiance despite her terror. "People on Earth will demand to know what happened to us." Patel smiled coldly. "Miss Chen, do you really think Earth cares about 1,000 colonists on Mars? This entire colony represents less than 1% of 1% of Earth's population. You're expendable, and you always have been." Sarah realized the full horror of their situation. They weren't just isolated by distance and hostile environment. They were politically and socially expendable. Earth's leaders could murder them all and face no consequences beyond some negative press coverage that would be forgotten within a news cycle. "However," Patel continued, "I'm not unreasonable. Dr. Webb will unfortunately suffer an environmental suit failure during tomorrow's maintenance rotation. But Ms. Chen, you have a choice. You can continue your work in the hydroponics bay. Keep quiet about what you've learned and live out whatever time you left in relative peace. Or you can join Dr. Webb in experiencing the fatal..." Sarah looked at Dr. Webb, seeing her own despair reflected in his eyes. They had failed. The evidence they had collected would disappear, and the experiment would continue until every colonist was dead. "I'll need an answer by morning," Patel said. "Think carefully, Miss Chen. Mars offers very few second chances." As the security team escorted Dr. Webb away, Sarah found herself alone with Dr. Park, who was still crying. "I'm sorry," Dr. Park whispered. "I'm so sorry." Sarah looked at the woman who had betrayed her and felt not anger, but pity. Dr. Park was as much a victim of the experiment as anyone else, forced to choose between her own conscience and the lives of children. "How many others?" Sarah asked quietly. What do you mean? How many other colonists have found out the truth?" Dr. Park's tears came harder. 7. You and Dr. Webb were the 8th and 9th. Sarah realized that the experiment's designers had created the perfect system of control by putting colonists in impossible situations where they had to choose between their principles and the lives of others. They ensured that any potential rebellion would be betrayed from within. That night, Sarah lay in her quarters, knowing it would probably be her last night alive. She had until morning to decide whether to accept Patel's offer of complicity in exchange for temporary survival, or to maintain her principles and die for them. As she wrestled with this impossible choice, Sarah heard something that made her sit up in shock. Through the thin walls of her quarters, she could hear voices. Other colonists, talking quietly but urgently. Sarah pressed her ear to the wall and listened. What she heard gave her the first hope she had felt since arriving on Mars. Can't let them keep killing people. Enough evidence now to prove what they're doing. Transmission window opens at 300. Sarah realized that she and Dr. Webb hadn't been the only colonists investigating the conspiracy. There were others, and they were planning their own mission to expose the truth. Quietly, Sarah tapped on the wall in a simple code pattern. After a moment, someone tapped back. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on her door. Sarah opened it to find a woman she didn't recognize. Someone who must have arrived on an earlier transport. Dr. Sarah Chen. The woman whispered, "Yes. I'm Dr. Amanda Foster, behavioral psychologist. We need to talk." Dr. Foster quickly explained that a group of colonists had been secretly documenting the experiment for months, building a comprehensive case against the colony's leadership. They had evidence of murders, system sabotage, deliberate resource restriction, and communication with Earth that proved the experimental nature of the colony. "Why didn't you contact me earlier?" Sarah asked. "We had to be sure you weren't working for Patel." Dr. Foster replied, "There are informants among the colonists, people who trade information for better treatment or medical care. We couldn't risk exposing our group." "What about Dr. Webb?" Dr. Foster's expression darkened. Dr. Webb was our inside source in atmospheric processing. His capture is a significant blow, but we have backup plans. Sarah felt a surge of hope, followed immediately by suspicion. "How do I know you're not testing me for Patel?" Dr. Foster smiled grimly. "Because if I were, I would have had you arrested already, instead of risking exposure of our entire operation." It was logical, but Sarah had learned not to trust anyone completely in the paranoid environment of the Mars colony. "What's the plan?" she asked. Dr. Foster outlined a complex scheme to simultaneously transmit evidence to multiple Earth-based news organizations and government agencies. They had identified security vulnerabilities in the colony's communication system and had developed a way to bypass the monitoring systems. "The transmission has to happen tonight," Dr. Foster explained. "Patel is planning to eliminate several more potential dissidents tomorrow, including you. Once he does that, our group will be too small and too exposed to continue operating." Sarah realized she was facing the same choice she had wrestled with all evening. But now the stakes were even higher. If she participated in this mission, and they were caught, not only would she die, but an entire resistance network would be exposed and eliminated. But if she refused, the murders would continue until every colonist who knew the truth was dead. "I'm in," Sarah said. Dr. Foster nodded. "Meet us in Maintenance Tunnel 7 in 30 minutes. And Sarah, if this goes wrong, if we're captured, remember that we tried to do the right thing." As Dr. Foster left, Sarah prepared for what she knew would be her final mission on Mars. She gathered the evidence she had collected, encrypted it according to Dr. Foster's specifications, and prepared a personal message to be transmitted alongside the official documentation. The message was simple: "To my family and friends on Earth, the Mars colony is not what you think it is. We are not pioneers or heroes. We are test subjects in an experiment that has cost hundreds of lives. If you receive this transmission, please remember us not as failures, but as people who tried to expose the truth about what was done to us in the name of science." As Sarah made her way through the dimly lit corridors toward Maintenance Tunnel 7, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just 4 days. She had arrived on Mars full of hope and ambition, ready to help build humanity's future among the stars. Now, she was a fugitive in that same colony, about to risk her life to expose the monstrous experiment that had been conducted on her and her fellow colonists. The tunnel was cramped and poorly lit, filled with pipes and cables that carried the colony's life support systems. Sarah found Dr. Foster waiting with 2 other colonists. Dr. James Harrison, a computer systems specialist, and Dr. Maria Santos, a communications engineer. "Status report," Dr. Foster whispered. Dr. Harrison activated a tablet that showed the colony's security grid. "Patrols are following normal patterns. We have a 15-minute window, starting at 310. Dr. Santos checked her equipment. "Transmitter is ready. We'll have approximately 8 minutes of transmission time before the security systems detect the breach." Dr. Foster looked at Sarah. "Last chance to change your mind. Once we start this, there's no going back." Sarah thought about Dr. Reeves, Dr. Torres, Dr. Webb, and all the other colonists who had died trying to expose the truth. "Let's do it." The group made their way through maintenance tunnels toward the emergency communication facility. The route was treacherous, requiring them to crawl through spaces barely large enough for a human body and navigate around pipes that carried scalding water and toxic chemicals. As they moved through the tunnels, Sarah began to understand how the colony's designers had created the perfect prison. The hostile environment outside made escape impossible. The complex, interconnected life support systems made sabotage extremely dangerous, and the social dynamics created by scarcity and fear made organized resistance nearly impossible. But somehow, despite all these obstacles, a group of scientists had managed to document the truth and prepare to expose it to the universe. They reached the emergency communication facility at exactly 308. Dr. Santos immediately began working on the transmitter, while Dr. Harrison monitored security systems. Dr. Foster stood watch, ready to warn of approaching patrols. "Transmitter is online. Beginning data upload." And Sarah watched as months of carefully collected evidence began streaming toward Earth at the speed of light. In just a few minutes, the truth about the Mars colony experiment would be in the hands of journalists, government officials, and human rights organizations across the solar system. But as the upload progressed, Dr. Harrison's expression grew increasingly concerned. "We have a problem," he whispered. "Security systems are adapting faster than expected. I think they've been upgraded since our last intelligence gathering." Dr. Foster checked her watch. "How much more time do we need?" Dr. Santos was working frantically at her controls. "At least 4 more minutes for complete upload." Dr. Harrison's screen flashed red. "Security breach detected. Automatic lockdown initiating." Sarah heard the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor outside. Patel's security team was coming. "Upload at 60%, Dr. Santos reported. "We need more time." Dr. Foster made a decision that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her short life. "Maria, Sarah, keep working. James and I will delay them." Before Sarah could protest, Dr. Foster and Dr. Harrison had sealed the communication facility door behind them and gone to face Patel's security team. Through the door, Sarah could hear shouting, then the distinctive whine of energy weapons. Dr. Foster and Dr. Harrison were buying time with their lives. Upload at 80%, Dr. Santos said, tears streaming down her face as she continued working. The sounds of conflict outside the door grew more intense. Sarah could hear Patel's voice, calm and commanding, ordering his security team to breach the facility. 90%. Dr. Santos whispered. The door began to buckle under sustained energy weapon fire. Sarah realized they had maybe 30 seconds before the security team would break through. 95%. But fast. Sarah could see the door beginning to melt around its edges. She prepared herself for death, hoping that their sacrifice would at least accomplish its purpose. Upload complete, Dr. Santos said quietly. The truth is out there now. The door collapsed inward, and Patel's security team rushed into the communication facility. Sarah and Dr. Santos raised their hands in surrender, knowing that resistance would only result in their deaths being more painful. Acting administrator stepped through the doorway, his expression cold with fury. Dr. Chen, Dr. Santos. I'm very disappointed in you both, and more disappointed in the fact that you forced me to take extreme measures to maintain colony security. Sarah looked at the man who had been conducting a monstrous experiment on 1,000 human beings and felt nothing but contempt. The truth is already on its way to Earth. Your experiment is over. Patel smiled coldly. Dr. Chen, you seem to be laboring under the misapprehension that Earth Command was unaware of your little resistance group. Did you really think you could organize a conspiracy in an environment where every conversation is monitored, every movement is tracked, and every action is recorded? Sarah felt her hope crumble. She realized the implications of Patel's words. That's right, Patel continued. Your entire resistance movement has been under observation from the beginning. Dr. Foster's recruitment of new members, your investigation of restricted files, even tonight's transmission. All of it has been allowed to proceed because it serves the experiment's purposes. Dr. Santos found her voice. What are you talking about? The experiment isn't just about how humans survive in hostile environments, Patel explained. It's about how human social structures adapt under extreme stress, including the formation and suppression of resistance movements. Your little rebellion has provided invaluable data about leadership emergence, group dynamics, and individual willingness to sacrifice for perceived moral principles. Sarah realized that they had been manipulated from the beginning. Every choice they thought they were making freely had actually been guided by the experiment's designers. Even the transmission, she whispered. Especially the transmission, Patel confirmed. Do you really think our communication security could be bypassed by a few colonists with basic technical training? The transmission you sent was allowed to go through because Earth Command wants to study how the revelation of the experiment's true nature affects public opinion and political decision-making. Sarah felt sick as she realized that even their final act of defiance had been part of the experimental protocol. But Patel wasn't finished. There's one more thing you should know, Dr. Chen. The data you transmitted tonight will never reach its intended recipients. Our Earth-based colleagues will intercept it, analyze it, and file it away as part of the experimental records. The people of Earth will never know what happened here. Dr. Santos collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by the hopelessness of their situation. Sarah remained standing, held upright only by her rage at the monstrous cruelty of the people who had designed this experiment. However, Patel continued, Your actions tonight have provided the final data points we needed for this phase of the experiment. Colony termination procedures will begin immediately. Sarah felt a new chill of horror. What? Sarah felt a new chill of horror. What do you mean? Termination procedures? Patel's smile was the most terrifying thing Sarah had ever seen. Dr. Jan, surely you didn't think the experiment would continue indefinitely. We've collected sufficient data on social breakdown, leadership hierarchies, resistance formation, and psychological deterioration under extreme stress. The next phase requires the complete elimination of all test subjects to study the final stages of colony collapse. Dr. Santos looked up from the floor where she was kneeling, her face pale with shock. You're going to murder everyone. Murder is such a crude term, Patel replied. We prefer controlled termination event. It will appear to be a catastrophic system failure, probably a fusion reactor overload that destroys the entire colony in a matter of minutes. Very clean, very definitive, and completely consistent with the known risks of Mars colonization. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what she was hearing. The other colonists, they don't know what's coming. Of course not. That would contaminate the data. We need to observe natural human behavior in the final hours before colony collapse. How do people react when they realize they're all going to die? Do they work together or turn on each other? Do they maintain their humanity or descend into savage self-preservation? Sarah realized that Patel and his team weren't just scientists conducting an experiment. They were monsters who viewed human suffering as data points to be collected and analyzed. How long? She asked quietly. Patel checked his chronometer. The reactor overload will occur in approximately 16 hours, just enough time to observe the final social dynamics as the colonists realize their situation is hopeless. Dr. Santos struggled to her feet. You can't do this. Even if Earth Command authorized this experiment, they would never approve. Mass murder. Patel's laugh was genuinely amused. Dr. Santos, who do you think designed the termination protocols? This isn't some rogue operation. The complete life cycle study of a failing Mars colony. From initial optimism through gradual deterioration to final collapse was always the plan. Every aspect of your lives here has been carefully orchestrated to produce the maximum amount of useful psychological and sociological data. Gee, Sarah felt a surge of desperate hope. But the transmission we sent, people on Earth will know what happened here. As I explained, that transmission will never reach the public. But even if it did, Dr. Chen, what do you think would happen? A few news stories about the tragic loss of a Mars colony? Perhaps some congressional hearings about the need for better safety protocols. The data we collect here will be used to design more success. Sarah realized that Patel genuinely believed he was serving a greater good, which made him even more dangerous than a simple sadist. He had convinced himself that murdering 1,000 people was justified by the scientific knowledge to be gained. Take them to isolation cells. Patel ordered his security team. I want them to observe the final phases of colony collapse. They're not to interact with the other subjects. Their knowledge of the termination timeline would contaminate the behavioral data as the security team moved to restrain them. Sarah made a desperate decision. She lunged toward the communication console, hoping to send some kind of warning to the other colonists. But before she could reach the controls, an energy weapon struck her in the back. sending waves of paralyzing pain through her nervous system. As Sarah collapsed to the floor, her muscles twitching uncontrollably from the weapon's effects, she heard Patel's voice as if from a great distance. "Pity, Dr. Chen. It would have made an interesting subject for the final observation period. But I suppose your sacrifice will provide useful data about individual heroism in hopeless situations." Sarah tried to speak, tried to move, but the weapon's neural disruptor had left her completely paralyzed. She could only watch as Dr. Santos was dragged away, screaming threats and pleas that echoed through the facility's corridors. Patel knelt beside Sarah's paralyzed form. "Don't worry, Dr. Chen. The neural disruption will wear off in a few hours. You'll be conscious and mobile for the colony's final moments. I wouldn't want you to miss the culmination of everything you've worked to expose." Sarah spent the next 4 hours in a windowless isolation cell, slowly recovering from the effects of the neural disruptor. As feeling returned to her limbs, she tried desperately to think of some way to warn the other colonists about the coming termination event. But the cell was completely sealed, with no communication access and no way to contact the outside. Sarah could only listen to the sounds of normal colony life through the walls. People going about their daily routines, unaware that they had less than 12 hours to live. When the cell door finally opened, Sarah was surprised to see Dr. Park standing in the doorway, flanked by 2 security guards. "Lisa?" Sarah struggled to her feet, her muscles still weak from the neural disruptor. Dr. Park's expression was unreadable. "Sarah, I need you to come with me. Administrator Patel wants you to observe the final phase of the experiment." Sarah studied her former friend's face, looking for any sign of the woman who had trained her, who had tried to protect her. "You knew, didn't you? You knew about the termination protocols." Dr. Park's composure cracked slightly. "I found out 6 months ago when Martinez had his breakdown. He discovered the termination timeline and tried to warn everyone. That's when Patel had him eliminated." Sarah felt sick. So Martinez didn't have a psychological break. He was murdered for trying to save people. The psychological break was real, Dr. Park said quietly. But it was caused by learning that everyone he was trying to protect was going to be killed anyway. It broke something in his mind. As they walked through the colony's corridors, Sarah noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. There were more security personnel visible, and some of the colonists looked nervous and confused. Word was apparently spreading that something was wrong. "How many people know?" Sarah asked. "And about the termination?" "Maybe 20. All of them essential personnel who need to maintain systems until the final moment. The others," Dr. Park's voice trailed off, "are going to die without ever knowing why. Patel says it's more humane this way. Quick, unexpected. No time for fear or despair." Sarah stared at Dr. Park in disbelief. "Do you actually believe that?" Dr. Park stopped walking and turned to face Sarah. "It doesn't matter what I believe. The termination is going to happen whether I cooperate or not. At least this way, I can try to minimize the suffering." Sarah realized that Dr. Park, like many of the colony's essential personnel, had been psychologically manipulated into accepting the unacceptable. The experiment's designers had created conditions where good people convinced themselves that participating in atrocities was the lesser evil. They arrived at the colony's main observation deck, where Patel was waiting with a group of technicians and security personnel. Through the transparent aluminum windows, Sarah could see the Martian landscape stretching to the horizon. Beautiful and deadly in the weak afternoon sun. "Ah, Dr. Chen," Patel said as she entered. "I'm glad you're feeling better. I wanted you to have a front row seat for the colony's final hours." Sarah looked around the observation deck and realized what she was seeing. Every person present was part of the experiment staff. The people who had been conducting the study of the colonists' behavior and psychology. She was looking at a team of scientists and technicians who had spent years watching 1,000 people slowly die, treating their suffering as data to be collected and analyzed. "Your own monsters," Sarah said quietly. One of the technicians, a young man who looked like he couldn't be older than 25, glanced up from his console. "Dr. Chen, this research will save thousands of lives in future colonial efforts. The psychological and social data we've collected will help design support systems that prevent the kind of breakdown we've observed here." Sarah stared at the young man, seeing the genuine conviction in his eyes. "And that justifies murdering 1,000 innocent people?" "The colonists volunteered for a high-risk mission," Patel interjected. "They knew when they came here that survival wasn't guaranteed. We simply ensured that their sacrifice produces maximum scientific value." Sarah realized that the experiment staff had been as thoroughly manipulated as the colonists themselves. They had been gradually conditioned to view human beings as expendable research subjects, convinced that the greater good justified any individual sacrifice. "Status report," Patel called to his team. "Reactor destabilization is proceeding on schedule," reported one of the technicians. "Critical cascade failure will occur in approximately 8 hours. Social monitoring?" Another technician consulted his displays. "Colony stress levels are increasing as expected. Some subjects are beginning to suspect that something is wrong, but no organized response has emerged yet." Sarah felt a surge of desperate hope. If some of the colonists suspected danger, maybe there was still time to organize some kind of evacuation or emergency response. But Patel seemed to read her thoughts. "Dr. Chen, I should mention that all escape pods and emergency evacuation systems have been disabled. Even if the colonists realized what was happening, there's nowhere for them to go. Mars doesn't offer many hiding places." Sarah sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the hopelessness of the situation. 1,000 people were going to die, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to save them. However, Patel continued, "There is one aspect of the final phase that I think will interest you. We're going to give the colonists a choice." Sarah looked up sharply. "What kind of choice?" Patel activated a large display screen that showed the colony's main assembly hall. Sarah could see hundreds of colonists gathered there, looking confused and anxious. "In approximately 1 hour, I'm going to address the colony," Patel explained. "I'm going to tell them the truth about the experiment, about the termination protocols, about their impending deaths, and then I'm going to offer them a choice." "What choice?" Sarah demanded. "They can die as heroes, believing that their sacrifice contributes to humanity's future among the stars. Or they can die knowing that they were nothing more than laboratory rats in a psychological experiment." It's a fascinating study in how people choose to frame their own mortality when given complete information about their circumstances. Sarah realized that even the colony's final moments had been designed as part of the experiment. Patel and his team were going to study how people reacted to learning they were about to die. How they chose to spend their final hours, whether they maintained their humanity or descended into chaos. "You're sick," Sarah whispered. "We're scientists," Patel replied, "and this is the most important psychological study ever conducted. The data we collect in the next 8 hours will revolutionize our understanding of human behavior under ultimate stress." Sarah watched the display screen as Patel's technicians prepared to broadcast his announcement to the colony. In just a few minutes, hundreds of innocent people were going to learn that they had been deceived from the beginning, that their entire lives on Mars had been nothing more than a monstrous experiment, and that they were all going to die within hours. But as Sarah studied the faces on the screen, she noticed something that gave her a spark of hope. Many of the colonists looked determined rather than defeated. These were people who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous missions in human history. They weren't going to give up easily, even when faced with certain death. Patel stepped up to the broadcast console and began his announcement. "Attention colonists of New Eden. This is Acting Administrator Patel speaking. Please gather in the main assembly hall for an urgent announcement regarding the colony's status." On the display screen, Sarah watched as the remaining colonists, perhaps 600 people who had survived the gradual elimination of potential dissidents, filed into the assembly hall. She recognized many faces from her brief time in the colony, people who had shown her kindness and friendship during her first few days on Mars. "Citizens of New Eden," Patel began, his voice carried throughout the colony by the public address system. "I have an announcement that will fundamentally change your understanding of your mission here." Sarah watched the faces on the screen, seeing confusion and growing alarm as Patel's tone registered with the colonists. "The Mars colony, designated New Eden, has never been intended as a permanent human settlement. You are participants in the most comprehensive psychological and sociological study ever conducted. For the past 3 years, every aspect of your lives has been observed, recorded, and analyzed as part of a research program designed to understand." The reaction in the assembly hall was immediate and explosive. Sarah could see colonists shouting, some trying to rush toward the exits, others standing in shocked silence. Security personnel moved to block the exits, their weapons visible but not yet raised. Furthermore, Patel continued, his voice remaining calm despite the chaos erupting in the assembly hall. "The colony's life support systems have been programmed for controlled failure. In approximately 7 hours, a cascade reactor failure will destroy the entire facility. This termination event is designed to provide data on human behavior in the final phases of community collapse." Sarah watched as the full horror of the situation sank in among the colonists. Some were screaming, others were weeping. Many were demanding explanations or pleading for mercy, but a significant number seemed to be organizing themselves, gathering in small groups and speaking urgently among themselves. "However," Patel said, his voice cutting through the noise, "I am prepared to offer you a choice regarding how you spend your remaining time." The assembly hall gradually quieted as the colonists realized that Patel was still speaking. "You can choose to spend your final hours knowing that you are contributing to humanity's future expansion into space. Your psychological and behavioral data will be used to design better colonies, to prevent the kinds of failures and breakdowns that have occurred here. You can die as heroes, knowing that your sacrifice serves the greater good." Sarah felt sick as she listened to Patel's manipulation, his attempt to convince dying people that their murder was somehow noble. Alternatively, Patel continued, you can spend your remaining time focused on the deception that has been practiced upon you. The fact that you have been treated as experimental subjects rather than human beings. You can die angry and bitter, knowing that everything you believed about your mission was a lie. Sarah realized that Patel was conducting one final psychological experiment, studying how people chose to interpret their own deaths when given complete information about their circumstances. But the colonists' response was not what Patel had expected. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, sister of the Jennifer Reeves, who had been murdered for asking too many questions, stepped forward in the assembly hall and spoke in a voice loud enough to be heard throughout the facility. Administrator Patel, you've made a fundamental error in your psychological analysis. Patel's expression showed surprise for the first time since Sarah had known him. Dr. Reeves? You've given us a false choice, Dr. Reeves continued. Die as heroes or die as victims. Third option that your experiment didn't account for. Sarah leaned forward, desperate to hear what Dr. Reeves was going to say. We can choose to live. The assembly hall erupted in cheers and shouts of agreement. Sarah watched in amazement as the colonists began organizing themselves with military precision, some heading toward the exits despite the security personnel. Others gathering around colonists who had technical expertise. Patel activated his communicator. Bot. Security teams, maintain order in the assembly hall. Use necessary force. But something had changed in the colony's atmosphere. The security personnel hesitated, looking uncertain. Sarah realized that many of them were colonists themselves, people who had been recruited to serve as enforcers, but who now understood that they were as expendable as everyone else. Dr. Reeves, Patel said, his voice now showing stress. You need to understand that the colony's location makes survival impossible. Mars's environment will kill you within hours if the life support systems fail. Dr. Reeves smiled grimly. Administrator, you've underestimated us from the beginning. We didn't volunteer for this mission because we were naive or desperate. We came here because we're survivors, problem solvers, people who thrive under pressure. And we've had 3 years to study this colony's systems. Sarah watched as groups of colonists began moving through the facility with obvious purpose. They weren't panicking or descending into chaos as Patel had expected. They were implementing some kind of coordinated plan. What are they doing? One of Patel's technicians asked nervously. Sarah began to understand what she was seeing. They're taking over the colony. Patel's face went white. That's impossible. They don't have access to critical systems. But even as he spoke, alerts began flashing on the technicians' consoles. Security doors throughout the facility were being overridden. Environmental controls were being rerouted. Communication systems were being accessed by unauthorized personnel. How? Patel demanded. Dr. Park, who had been standing quietly beside Sarah, spoke for the first time since they'd arrived at the observation deck. Because they're not just test subjects in Minute. They're engineers, programmers, systems analysts, and scientists. And they've been watching your security protocols for 3 years. Sarah realized that Dr. Park had been playing a deeper game than anyone suspected. Lisa, you've been helping them. Dr. Park nodded. Not everyone who knew about the experiment chose to collaborate with it. Some of us have been preparing for this moment. Patel spun to face Dr. Park. his composure finally cracking. "You've sabotaged the entire research program." "I've saved the lives of 600 innocent people," Dr. Park replied calmly. Something I should have done 3 years ago. Alarms began sounding throughout the observation facility as the colonists' takeover of the colony's systems accelerated. Sarah watched the displays with growing amazement as critical systems came online under colonist control. "Reactor status," Patel shouted to his technicians. "Destabilization sequence has been halted." One of them reported, "Reactors returning to stable operation. Life support. Environmental systems are operating at optimal parameters. Someone has bypassed our control protocols." Sarah realized that the colonists weren't just preventing their own deaths. They were seizing complete control of the colony's infrastructure. "Communications?" Patel asked desperately. The answer came not from his technicians, but from the facility's speakers as Dr. Reeves' voice filled the observation deck. "Administrator Patel, this is Dr. Elizabeth Reeves speaking on behalf of the Free Colonists of New Eden. We have assumed control of all critical colony systems. Your experiment is over." Patel grabbed a communicator. "Dr. Reeves, you need to understand that this facility cannot survive without proper administrative oversight. The systems are too complex, too interconnected. Lol. Administrator, Dr. Reeves interrupted. "We've been maintaining these systems for 3 years while you've been deliberately sabotaging them. I think we can manage." Sarah felt a surge of hope as she realized what was happening. The colonists weren't just rebelling. They were proving that they could run the colony more effectively than the people who had been conducting the experiment. But Patel wasn't finished. "Dr. Reeves, even if you maintain control of the colony systems, you're still trapped on Mars. Earth Command will never authorize supply shipments to a colony in revolt. Administrator, we've been studying the supply manifests and communication logs for months. We know that Earth Command has been deliberately restricting supplies as part of the experiment. We also know that there are supply caches hidden throughout the Mars system. Emergency reserves that were positioned for genuine colonization efforts." Sarah watched Patel's expression change from confidence to confusion to fear. He realized that the colonists had been preparing for this moment far longer than he had suspected. "Furthermore," Dr. Reeves continued, "we've been monitoring your communications with Earth. We know about the backup facilities, the observation posts, the supply ships that have been stationed just outside Mars orbit. We know this experiment was much larger than just New Eden." Patel's technicians were looking at each other with growing alarm. Sarah realized that the colonists had somehow gained access to classified information about the entire experimental program. "How?" Patel whispered. The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Marcus Webb, whom Sarah had thought was dead, stepped through the observation deck's doorway flanked by armed colonists. "Hello, Administrator," Webb said calmly. "Sorry to disappoint you, but reports of my death were greatly exaggerated." Sarah stared at Webb in shock. "Marcus, how are you alive?" Webb smiled grimly. "Environmental suit failure was staged. Dr. Park and I have been working together for months to document the full scope of the experiment and prepare for the colonists' liberation." Pahel backed against the observation windows. His confident facade completely collapsed. "This is impossible. The experimental protocols accounted for organized resistance." "Your protocols accounted for resistance by desperate isolated, slowly dying test subjects, Webb replied. They didn't account for resistance by organized scientists who had been secretly documenting and preparing to counter your methods for years. Sarah began to understand the true scope of what had been happening. The resistance hadn't been a spontaneous reaction to discovering the truth about the experiment. It had been a carefully planned operation involving dozens of colonists working in secret for years. The transmission we sent, Sarah said suddenly. That wasn't your first communication with Earth, was it? Dr. Park shook her head. We've been sending covert messages to news organizations, government officials, and human rights groups for over a year. Your transmission was just the final piece of evidence we needed to build our case. Webb activated a portable display unit. Sarah, your courage in trying to expose the truth, even knowing it might cost your life, convinced several hesitant colonists to join our cause. Your actions may have saved everyone here. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. So the resistance was real. All of this time, people were actually fighting back, documenting crimes, preparing legal cases, and planning for this moment, Webb confirmed. Administrator Patel's experiment included monitoring social dynamics and resistance formation. But it failed to account for the possibility that the subjects might be smarter and more organized than the experimenters. Patel was looking around desperately, apparently searching for some way to regain control of the situation. Even if you maintain control of the colony, Earth Command will never recognize your authority. You're still criminals, still expendable test subjects. Dr. Reeves' voice came through the speakers again. Administrator, while you've been conducting your experiment, we've been conducting our own research. We've documented every crime committed against the colonists, every system sabotage, every murder disguised as an accident. We have evidence of violations of interplanetary law, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit mass murder, Webb added, and that evidence has already been transmitted to legal authorities throughout the solar system. The experimental program that created this situation has been exposed completely. Sarah watched as Patel's world collapsed around him. The man who had seemed so confident in his control over life and death was now just another criminal facing justice for his crimes. But the true scope of the colonists' victory became clear when Dr. Reeves made her final announcement. Citizens of New Eden, I'm pleased to report that we have received confirmation from Earth that the Mars colonial experiment has been terminated by emergency order of the Solar Council. All personnel involved in the experiment are to be arrested and charged with crimes against humanity. Nay, hadn't... Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she realized what this meant. The colonists hadn't just survived. They had won completely. Furthermore, Dr. Reeves continued, the Solar Council has recognized New Eden as a legitimate independent colony with full self-governance authority. Supply ships are already being dispatched to provide necessary resources and medical support. The observation deck fell silent as the full implications sank in. Sarah looked around at Patel's technicians and security personnel, seeing the same shock and disbelief she felt. How? She whispered. Webb smiled. Because the experiment's designers made a fundamental error in their assumptions. They believed that isolated, desperate people couldn't organize effective resistance. They underestimated the intelligence, determination, and basic human decency of the people they were experimenting on, Dr. Park added. They also underestimated the willingness of good people on Earth to act when presented with evidence of crimes being committed in their names. The experimental program had political support only as long as people believed it was ethical and necessary. Once the truth was revealed, Sarah realized that the colonists' victory was complete not just on Mars, but throughout the solar system. The people responsible for the experiment would face justice, and the survivors would be able to build the kind of colony they had originally dreamed of. What happens now? Sarah asked. Webb gestured toward the windows, where Sarah could see colonists moving across the Martian landscape in environmental suits, no longer prisoners but free inhabitants of their chosen world. Now we build a real colony, Webb said. Not an experiment, not a test facility, but a genuine human community on Mars. We prove that people can survive and thrive here, not because they're being manipulated and observed, but because they choose to work together toward common goals. Sarah looked out at the red landscape of Mars, seeing it not as a hostile environment designed to test human endurance, but as humanity's second home. The colonists had not only survived the brutal experiment conducted on them, they had emerged stronger, more united, and more determined than ever. But Sarah's story was not over. As she stood in the observation deck, watching her fellow colonists begin the work of building a real life on Mars, she realized that her role in the colony's liberation was just the beginning of a much larger mission. Over the following days, as supply ships arrived from Earth, and the true scope of the experimental program was revealed, Sarah learned that New Eden had been just one of several research facilities conducting similar studies throughout the solar system. There were other colonies, other groups of people being used as test subjects in psychological and sociological experiments, and they needed to be liberated too. Dr. Webb found Sarah in the hydroponics bay, where she was working to repair the systems that had been deliberately sabotaged during the experiment. Sarah, we need to talk, he said. The Solar Council has asked us to provide assistance in locating and liberating other experimental facilities. They want someone who understands what the test subjects are going through. Someone who can help expose these programs. Someone who can help expose these programs. Sarah looked around the bay, where healthy plants were growing for the first time since she had arrived on Mars. The colonists had already made remarkable progress in repairing and improving their living conditions, proving that they were capable of far more than their captors had believed. What would that involve? She asked. Traveling to other colonies, gathering evidence, helping organize resistance movements. Webb replied, it would be dangerous work. Some of the other experimental programs may be even more ruthless than what we experienced here. Sarah thought about the colonists who were still trapped in similar situations. People who were being studied and manipulated and slowly murdered in the name of scientific research. When do we leave? She said. Webb smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. There's a supply ship departing for the Jupiter system tomorrow. Intelligence suggests there are at least 3 experimental facilities in operation around Jupiter's moons. Sarah realized that her time on Mars had changed her in fundamental ways. She had arrived as a naive scientist, believing she was participating in humanity's expansion into space. She was leaving as a liberation specialist, someone dedicated to exposing and stopping the monstrous experiments being conducted on innocent people throughout the solar system. But she was also leaving with hope. The colonists of New Eden had proven that ordinary people could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances when they worked together with courage and determination. If they could liberate themselves from one of the most comprehensive psychological experiments ever conducted, then similar liberation was possible elsewhere. As Sarah prepared to leave Mars, she stood once more on the observation deck where she had watched Patel's empire collapse. But now, instead of looking out at a prison disguised as a colony, she saw a thriving human community that had built something beautiful out of the wreckage of a monstrous experiment. The red landscape of Mars stretched to the horizon, no longer a hostile environment designed to test human limits, but humanity's second home. And scattered across that landscape, Sarah could see the lights of new construction projects, expanded habitats, research facilities that were conducting genuine scientific work rather than studying human suffering. The first Mars colony had succeeded, not because of careful experimental design, but because human beings were capable of far more than their oppressors had ever imagined. Sarah's story on Mars was ending, but her larger mission was just beginning. Somewhere in the outer solar system, other people were trapped in similar experiments, waiting for someone to expose the truth and help them fight for their freedom. And Sarah Chen, who had once believed she wouldn't survive a single day on Mars, was going to help them do exactly that.